Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a college professor, and there is no other job I would want in the world. And if you're watching this video, it is possible that you feel the same way, regardless of whether you are a high school student or a college undergraduate thinking about applying for grad school, or someone who's been in the workforce for a while and thinks you might want to transition to academia. So I wish that I could say, here are 5 easy steps to becoming a college professor. I am going to give you 5 steps, but they're not easy, and in most cases represent a decade or so of your life. But if this is your dream, it is totally worth it. So first, you need to figure out what your field is, and also what research looks like in that field. Now, for a lot of you, you might figure this out while you're in undergrad, and you don't have to know it going in. It's very common to switch majors when you're getting a bachelor's degree, even drastically switch majors. And you can even shift fields a little bit during this process. For example, I started out in psychology as an undergraduate and ended up in a field that's closer to computer science, but sort of at the intersection. That said, it's kind of unusual to say, get a bachelor's degree in chemistry and then someday become a German literature professor. But probably not unheard of. But one way to think about this is, what is the thing that you want to learn about and create new knowledge about for the rest of your career? You also need to know what research in that field looks like so that you can know if that's what you want to do for a really long time. Because even if you end up as a professor who does mostly teaching, you're still going to have to do research as part of your PhD. And I will do a whole video about how to get involved in research as an undergrad, and also the kinds of things you can do in undergrad to set yourself up for good applications to PhD programs. But the short version is, ask around for your particular discipline. For example, if you're in a STEM field, it probably means working in a research lab with a professor. In some other disciplines, you might be able to get a really good taste of research just by taking certain kinds of classes or doing an honors thesis. All right, and now a caveat going into the next one, which is that in most fields, you do need a PhD to be a professor, for most fields and most kinds of professor positions. But there are some kinds of, especially teaching-oriented positions where you might not. For example, community college, sometimes you can teach at community colleges with a master's degree, or certain types of instructor's positions you can do with a master's degree. Or in some disciplines, a PhD is not the terminal degree. For example, if you want to be a law professor, you need to go to law school. And also, if you want to be, say, a dance professor, the terminal degree is probably an MFA. But for most disciplines, the majority of professor jobs out there require or are much easier to get with a PhD. So you should find out what the landscape looks like for your field. But probably the next step is get a PhD. Now, if you're new here, I have a lot of videos about applying for PhD programs, and if you're in that position, I hope they're helpful. I'm not going to go into detail here about how the PhD application process works, but part of it might involve, for example, narrowing down that thing that you want to learn about for the rest of your life into something that is not quite as broad as computer science or chemistry. But if you're at this step, you will find other videos on this channel, so you'll have hours of me talking about way more than I could say here. In any case, for most professor positions, you need a PhD, so the first thing to do is get into a PhD program. And then, once you're in that PhD program, the next step is, at some point during that PhD, you need to start thinking about what kind of professor you want to be. Mostly the big question here is, do you want to do mostly research, mostly teaching, or a combination of the two? And there's a spectrum. And your answer to this question is going to change the kind of professor positions that you want to think about, as well as the kinds of institutions that you want to think about working at. Now, first of all, if you hate teaching, I beg of you, do not become a professor who teaches. There are industry research positions, there are research scientist positions, there are sometimes even research professorships. But if you hate teaching, you're going to be a bad teacher, and it's bad for students, and just don't do it. Do something else. So let's assume that you want to be a professor in part because you want to do at least some teaching. There's still a big difference between research heavy and teaching heavy positions, and this will change the way that you want to set yourself up in grad school to have successful applications to those kinds of jobs. For example, some positions are almost 100% teaching with very little, if any, research expectations. For example, teaching at a community college or some liberal arts universities or even some primarily undergraduate serving institutions. Or instructor or lecturer positions even at some research universities. There are also some positions that are more balanced between research and teaching. One way to think about this is how big is someone's teaching load? How many classes are they teaching? Because the rest of their time is probably spent mostly on research. I'll also add as a brief caveat here that I am familiar with universities in the United States, and so I'm not sure how some of this might vary if you're thinking about positions in other countries, for example. If you are the kind of professor that I am, which is a tenure track faculty member at an R1 research institution in the United States, I actually have a whole video about what my job is like. The kinds of things that I do, how much I teach, what my research expectations are, what I do in terms of grant funding and service and all of that. So check that out if you want to know what that kind of job is like. And also for that kind of job, you do teach, and it's really important. However, your job performance in terms of will you get tenure, for example, is more about research than teaching. So in that case, research needs to be something that you enjoy and that you can do well at. And you should find out what this looks like for your field. For example, if you were a tenure track faculty at an R1 university, would you be expected to seek and get grant funding in order to get tenure? Because some people super hate that. And if that's the case, you might want to go into a more teaching-oriented position. And of course, while you're a PhD student, you're going to be finding out what it's like to do research in your field because you're going to be a researcher. And so you can find out how much you like it. And you need to do the same thing with teaching. So especially if you're thinking about seeking teaching-heavy positions, you should take the opportunity, if you have it, to teach a class on your own, and even to develop your own class if you have the opportunity. And finally, one of the best ways to figure out what all of this looks like for your discipline is to talk to other professors in your discipline, and not just at your institution. Especially if you're getting a PhD at one of those research-heavy institutions, you should talk to people who have other kinds of jobs. You're not just being trained to be a carbon copy of your PhD advisor. There are actually a lot of different kinds of options out there. All right, and then once you figure that out, the kind of position you think you want, you should start building your CV towards that kind of job. So for example, again, if you think you want to apply to teaching jobs, make sure you have a lot of teaching experience, because you're probably even going to need things like sample syllabi and student evaluations for your job applications. That will also help you if you're applying for a tenure track job at an R1, because you do have to teach, and being a good teacher is awesome. But of course, also if you want that R1 tenure track job, you're going to have to show research output, which typically means publications. Of course, what the expectations are is going to vary a lot by field. For example, in computer science, you're expected to have a number of papers published before you're on the job market. If you are in a more book-based discipline, it might be common to not have publications or very few, but you're on your way to a dissertation that's likely going to be a book, and people are very excited about. Also consider, for example, maybe you want to be a law professor. Law students in general actually don't tend to have to do a lot of scholarly work. But if your goal is to be a law professor, you should take every opportunity that you can to do it. Being on law reviews, writing a student note, taking seminar-style classes where you write papers, setting yourself up for the job that you want. In the same way that if you really wanted to be a trial lawyer, you should do mock trial. You also might need some time post-PhD to build your CV more. And one of the really common ways to do this is to get a postdoc. So a postdoc is a position that's kind of in between being a PhD student and being a professor. It's often for a particular funded research project, and these can be really good because they give you more time to get out publications after your dissertation. They give you the ability to work with a new supervisor who can write you a letter of rec. They give you experience on a related but different type of research project that will show your breadth as a researcher. And there also are some teaching-oriented postdocs as well. And then the very last step, conquer the academic job market. If you're going to be a professor, you have to apply to and land a professor job. And all of the steps leading up to this could represent a decade of your life, but this one still might be the hardest. Now, something to keep in mind is that the academic job market looks very different for different fields. It's just a reality that it's easier to get a job as a computer science professor than for an English professor. It's not fair, that's just how it is. And so also knowing the reality of the job market in your discipline and thinking about options if you weren't successful should actually be part of your decision space in deciding whether you want to get a PhD in the first place. But you also just might need to broaden your application scope. For example, if you really want to be a tenure track professor at an R1 research university, would you still be fine with being an instructor at a liberal arts university? One way to think about the kinds of jobs to apply for is, would you rather have this job or wait a little bit and put your career starting on hold while you wait for a better opportunity? Same kind of thing in deciding where you want to apply. The broader you're able to think geographically, the easier time you'll have. And this is just because, particularly depending on the kind that you want, you never know where they're going to be open in any particular year. When I was on the academic job market and trying to explain to my family and friends why I couldn't stay in the city or even the state that I was in, was that it was kind of like the NFL. You never know what team is going to need a tight end in any particular year. You can't hold out for a position with this NFL team because you really want to live in this city. You go where they want you. And it can be a little bit like that. Another thing is that it is increasingly common for faculty to move around. So if you get what doesn't seem like your dream job, you can always consider applying for different jobs in a few years after you have more experience, more teaching, more publications, etc. I actually have a blog post with some advice for academic job hunting, as well as copies of my own job materials. If it's helpful, I will link to that in the description down below. And this can be a tough process, so make sure that you have good mentorship, people to get advice from, including, say, people who've been on the job market recently, and a good support system around you. So in a lot of ways, all of this about how to become a professor is the same as how to become any job. So the overall steps here are: decide what field you want to be in, decide what kind of job you want, get the right degree and right experience for that kind of job, and then apply for them until you get one. In that way, you become a college professor in the same way that you become anything else. It can just be a little bit of a longer process sometimes. And remember, new professors are hired every year. Why can't it be you? So if you have decided that this is your dream, and maybe you're not in graduate school yet, I hope that this channel is helpful in helping you think about applying for PhD programs. If you're in a PhD program, I hope that this channel is helpful in terms of you being as successful as you possibly can be. And I wish you the very best of luck. As I said, I wouldn't want any other job, and I feel fortunate every day that I'm in the position that I'm in. And Casey, thanks for watching.